In today's episode, we're going over the complete guide to ankle mobility for better squatting and Olympic lifts. Let's get it rolling. Welcome to the Fitness Pain-Free Show, where I help physical therapists learn how to get their clients out of pain and back to training in the gym. My name is Dan Pope, and I'll be your instructor. I'm a physical therapist, coach, and fellow meathead. I love training just as much as you do and want to help you get all of your patients out of pain and back to the gym where they belong. First and foremost, thank you so much for your support. You truly allow me to do what I love for a living, which is to share fitness, physical therapy, all this great stuff. My name is Dan Pope. I'm a physical therapist, coach, personal trainer, and a meathead. This is the Fitness Pain-Free Show, where we help coaches and physical therapists like you get your patients out of pain and back to training. If you're watching this on YouTube, please hit that like button, comment, and subscribe to the channel. If you're listening to this via podcast, give me a positive rating and review. It helps a ton. Let's get rolling here. So why is ankle mobility important for Olympic lifts? Well, first and foremost, it's super important for performance, right? So it allows two things. It's going to allow you to go deeper into the squat. If I have more ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, I can get my butt closer to my heels, right? And if you look at this picture to the left of my buddy Duesh that has amazing ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, he's very, very deep in the squat. On the right is me, who has less ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, and this is as deep as I can go. And what you'll notice is that the barbell is actually a little bit higher for me, all right? So if I'm trying to lift as much weight as humanly possible, I want to be able to squat as deep as I can. Because when I pull the bar up from the floor, right, when I clean or I snatch the bar and I am pulling the bar up and I get to triple extension, I'm getting the bar as high as I can, right? If I can get underneath of that bar more easily, I don't have to pull the bar quite as high. And as that weight gets heavier, you can't pull the bar quite as high. So the victor is going to go to the person who has the ankle mobility to get down there, right? So as you can see, Duesh doesn't have to pull the bar quite as high as I do, right? Because he can get a little bit deeper, right? The other piece is that having great ankle dorsiflexion range of motion is going to make your torso a little bit more upright when you squat, and also when you receive a barbell for a clean and for a snatch. Okay, so again, if you look at Duesh on the left, his torso is more upright than mine is simply because he has that ankle dorsiflexion range of motion. So if I'm catching a clean and I want to keep my elbows upright, it's going to be a little bit easier to stay in a good position if I have the ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, right? And the same thing goes for the snatch. So when I catch the barbell in a snatch, if I don't have a good position of my torso, it's actually kind of hard to get the barbell over my head and to balance it there. I have to be at an extreme range of motion at my shoulders, and I'm probably more likely to pitch that barbell forward because I don't have the strength and control of the shoulder at that extreme range of motion. If I get a little more ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, I stay upright, that overhead position for the overhead squat and the snatch becomes a whole heck of a lot easier. Okay? Why else? So having more ankle dorsiflexion range of motion allows you to reduce stress in other areas of the body, right? And I say reduce, this is not always the case, and we'll talk about this a little bit later for the specific cases where it's not necessarily true. But when you're doing, let's say, a snatch or an overhead squat, you need to have a ton of range of motion from a lot of different areas, right? So if you don't have great range of motion coming from the ankle, the knee, the hip, the thoracic spine, and the shoulders, not only is a snatch going to be very, very challenging, not only is a clean going to be very, very challenging, but other joints are going to have to make up for that lack of range of motion that you're missing, let's say, at the ankle, right? So if I have a really stiff ankle joint, it makes sense that I'm going to have to move a little bit more from the hip, the lower back, the shoulder, as well as the wrist. So the first place where having more ankle dorsiflexion will alter stress somewhere else is going to be at the knee, right? And I love saying this because most folks that, when we're thinking about ankle dorsiflexion range of motion and knee health, most folks blanketly think that, okay, more ankle mobility is better knee health, right? Well, I would say yes and no. So here's the thing. We have two athletes here. So one athlete is going to be me. I'm on the right. And the other athlete's going to be my friend Duesh on the left. Duesh has some of the best ankle mobility of anyone I've ever met in my entire life, right? So this is him in the very bottom position of a squat. And if you look from the side, you can very clearly see he has a ton of ankle dorsiflexion range of motion. And you look at me, I actually have quite a bit less ankle dorsiflexion range of motion. Okay. The other thing you'll notice is that Duesh's knee is more anterior to his center of mass. So his knee comes really far forward compared to me. I'm not able to get my knee forward quite as much, right? And this becomes a physics equation. So if you look at the center of mass from the barbell down to Duesh's feet, his knees are quite a bit forward of that center of mass, which creates a bigger moment arm for the knee to produce force, which is going to put more stress on the knee. On the other side, you have me, and I can't dorsiflex my ankle quite as much. I don't have as big of a moment arm for my knee to produce force. I actually have a bigger moment arm for my hip and spine to produce a little bit of force. And because of that, I end up putting a little bit more stress on my spine, whereas Duesh is going to put a little bit more stress through his knee, right? So if you have more ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, that's actually going to allow you to put more stress through the joint and use the quad a little bit more so. The other thing you'll notice for Duesh is he actually has a deeper squat. He's getting deeper down towards the floor than I am, right? And that's partly because he has this ankle dorsiflexion range of motion. For me, the barbell is actually a little bit higher. I can't get quite as deep. So if you know much about the knee joint, at least at the patellofemoral joint, generally speaking, I know that depending on the article you read, there's people are going to argue this, but you're going to put a little bit more stress on the patellofemoral joint as you descend deeper into the squat. So the reason being is that there's less surface area available within the patellofemoral joint, also the tibiofemoral joint, to dissipate those forces as you descend deeper and deeper into the squat. So if you have great ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, that also means you have the potential to put more stress in the knee joint, okay? So do keep that in mind when you're trying to increase ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, or if you use something like a heel lift or Olympic weightlifting shoe, it actually may increase some of the stress on the knee, okay? So how might ankle dorsiflexion decrease stress on the knee, right? I know I just talked about how ankle mobility is going to increase stress on the knee. How can it also decrease stress on the knee? Well, here's the thing. If you're lacking ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, as you descend deeper and deeper into a squat, as you run out of ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, but you need to get deeper into the squat, the body will start to compensate. It does this through the subtalar joint. And what you'll notice in a lot of athletes is that their arch will flatten out and their feet will spin out. And if you're doing a single-legged squat and you hit the end range of motion, generally you'll see a little less toe out, but you'll see some knee in, right? And we all, have heard that knee in is bad for the knee. And I'm not sure if it's necessarily bad, but what is occurring when you have knee in or toe out is that you're putting more stress to the lateral side of the patellofemoral joint. So if you think about the patellofemoral joint as a train on train tracks, as my knee comes in, the train's going to be on the outside of the train tracks or the lateral side of the train tracks. There's less surface area available to dissipate force. So we have more stress just on the outside of the knee joint. So if I get better ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, when I go deeper into a squat, I won't have to compensate as much by going into pronation, right? By moving to the subtalar joint, I'll be able to keep the knee lined up with the toe and keep that force spread evenly within the patellofemoral joint, right? So if we have ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, it allows us to move in a little bit of a healthier way, we'll say. Okay. So it's not just the knee that the ankle affects. It affects everything up the chain, right? So if you look at an overhead squat, I need to have great mobility coming from my ankles, my knees, my hips, my thoracic spine, as well as my shoulder. And if I'm missing mobility at any area, I have to make up for it elsewhere, okay? So the ankle is not only going to affect the joint immediately above it, it's going to affect several joints further up, okay? And one of the big ones is going to be the lower back. So as I descend into a squat, I'm naturally going to get a little bit of lower back rounding or lumbar flexion, right? Some folks would call this butt wink. Butt wink is not inherently bad, right? But if you have an athlete in front of you that has flexion-based low back pain, their back hurts a lot when you round. If you can get more range of motion coming from the ankle, you may find they can squat more comfortably, right? So oftentimes in folks that have this chronic flexion-based low back pain, where every time they go back to squatting, they keep on hurting themselves over and over again, I'll see if we can get a little bit extra range of motion coming from the other joints, specifically coming from the ankle, right? Sometimes I'll add a heel lift or Olympic lifting shoe and see if we can get the depth we want without irritating the lower back, right? So the other way the ankle mobility is going to decrease stress on the lower back is going to be by changing the moment arm, right? And this is a physics equation. It's just like we talked about before. So in this graph, and I apologize if you're listening to me via podcast and it's confusing, go to YouTube and check it out because I have a nice graph that shows this all out, some nice images. So on the left is me doing a box squat. So when you do a box squat, there's very little ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, okay? And on the far right side, I'm doing a goblet squat with a heel lift, right? And with this goblet squat with the heel lift, I'm using all of my dorsiflexion range of motion, plus my heel is elevated, all right? And what happens in the far right situation, the goblet squat, my knee is so far forward, right, that I actually create a nice moment arm from my knee to my center of mass, right? And now the moment arm from my center of mass to my hips is very small. So when I do a heels elevated goblet squat and I really allow my knees to come forward, I end up allowing my knees and quads to produce a lot of force, and my hips and spine actually can't produce as much force, right? Now, if I compare that to the box squat on the far left, when I'm sitting back to the box, I have little to no moment arm for my knee to produce force. It's pretty much up to my hip and my spine to do almost all of the work, right? So if I have an individual that has a really stiff ankle, every time they try to squat, they're not going to be able to bring their knee forward to create a nice moment arm for the knee. They have to produce all that force from the hip and the spine, right? So what ends up happening is that if I have someone who has quite a bit of low back pain, they have zero ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, I might try to mobilize that ankle so I can get the knee to contribute a little bit more to producing force in the squat, right? So you can see how that'd be a nice strategy in folks that have this chronic low back pain with zero ankle dorsiflexion. We want to get them to be able to squat without as much pain, and movement at the ankle may help us with that. So how about the hips? Well, the hips are actually super similar to the spine. Okay, we're going to use the same exact description. So if I have zero ankle dorsiflexion range of motion and every single squat I do looks like a box squat where my hips come really far back, then I create a giant moment arm for the hip. So the hip has to do more work to get out of the hole in the squat, right? Now, if I flip that to a goblet squat with my heels elevated, as I descend into the squat, it allows me to be very upright, allows my knees to come forward. And now when I'm producing force out of the hole, I have a nice moment arm for my knees, for my quads to produce force. And the hips actually can't produce as much force because they're not in a great position to do it, right? So if I have an athlete who's stiff in the ankles and every squat looks like that box squat, I know that they have to use their hips to get out of the hole in the squat. If I grant them a little extra ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, I know that now I can take some of that force and push it over onto the knees and decrease some of the stress on the hips, right? So having extra dorsiflexion gives me some options so I can decrease some of the stress on the hip, right? And here's the other piece. In folks that have, let's say, femoral acetabular impingement syndrome, labral pathology, or hip arthritis is a big one too, these folks tend not to tolerate end range of motion of the hip. And this is in all different directions, but especially hip flexion. So descending into the bottom of the squat is particularly painful in these folks, right? So end ranges hurt. If I can get extra end range from other joints, then I can reduce the range of motion required at the hip and hopefully reduce a little bit of pain, right? So I have an image right here, which is showing a squat with limited ankle dorsiflexion range. And what you'll notice is that in order to get deeper in the squat, I have to utilize more motion at the hip, right? On the far right side, I have an image of myself where I'm trying to utilize all of my ankle dorsiflexion range of motion and I'm elevating the heel, right? And what you'll notice here is I can get the same depth in that squat with much less hip flexion, right? So if I have someone who has a really cranky or irritated hip, and I want to try to get them to be able to squat for the long term without bothering it, I can give them more ankle dorsiflexion. I can improve their ankle dorsiflexion over the course of time to get them a little bit out of pain, right? So How about the shoulders? Now the shoulders are, it's very, very obvious about the stress on the shoulder and the snatch, but it also is going to apply for the clean. I'm going to show you that in a minute. So if you are snatching, right, and you're trying to catch the barbell in a super upright position and you're lacking range of motion at the ankle, that's going to pitch your torso forward, right? And when you pitch your torso forward greatly, you still have to get the barbell over your center of mass. You still have to keep that barbell overhead, right? And in order to do that, you're going to crank that shoulder into flexion and abduction, right? And I know you've seen this before. So if you've coached Olympic lifting for any period of time and you have someone who's super stiff, let's say in the hips and the ankles, then it's going to be very, very hard for those folks to keep the bar over top of the shoulder, right? Contrast this to someone who has amazing ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, like this other gentleman to the left, who has great ankle dorsiflexion. He's super upright when he catches his snatch, right? His overhead squat looks beautiful. You have, you have very little motion occurring at the shoulder in comparison to what's going on the right side. So having extra ankle dorsiflexion range of motion is going to greatly reduce the amount of motion required at the shoulder, right? So like I said, most folks, when they think about ankle dorsiflexion and thinking about requirements for Olympic lifts, they think about the snatch, just because if you have limited motion at the ankle and you pitch your torso forward, it's going to be super tough to catch that weight overhead. But the same thing goes with a clean, right? So I don't think we tend to think about this, but when you hit the very bottom position of a squat, when you're doing a clean, your torso does incline a little bit, and we have to keep the elbows up facing forward. In order to do that, you need a decent amount of shoulder flexion combined with external rotation range of motion. And if you don't have the range of motion at your ankle, you're going to actually need more motion at the shoulder, right? So if you've got cranky wrists, cranky shoulders, and you're having pain in the front squat or clean, it might simply be because you're lacking range of motion somewhere downstream, particularly at the ankle, right? So better ankle mobility might improve health of the wrists, might improve health of the shoulders over the course of time, puts you in a better position so you can get out of the hole of a clean or front squat with less issue, right? So how do we actually assess ankle mobility so we can have deeper squats, right? So the first step is just to visualize your athlete squatting from the side, right? So have your athlete do overhead squat, front squat, body weight squat, whatever squat you want, okay? And then you just look at the ankle and see how much you feel like it's bending, right? Take a look at the torso ankle. Are they really severely pitching forward, right? And if they're not in the position you want them to be in, then you try to cue them to get into the position. So if I have an athlete like I have in the image here who's severely bent over, right? Looks like she's not bending at the ankles whatsoever. I'm going to say, hey, bring your knees forward. Sink a little deeper to that squat by bringing the knees forward, right? Reach your knees towards my hands. Maybe I'll put my hands in front of her knees. I'm trying to get her to use all of her ankle dorsiflexion range of motion. And if that cleans up the motion, then they probably aren't stiff within the joint because they just show me they're able to move through that joint. But if they are not able to move through that joint, even with cueing, it still looks pretty bad. The next step is actually assessing the joint for mobility, right? So the assessment is actually quite easy. I do a wall ankle dorsiflexion assessment. So I have a video for this you can check out. I'll put that up there for you to click later. But you go into half kneeling, right? And you set your toe about 4 inches away from the wall. For folks that are really, really tall, they probably need to get a little closer to 5 inches. For folks that are a little bit shorter, I think 4 inches will suffice. The heel stays flat the entire time. You want to make sure that your arch is maintained, right? Like I said before, if we're lacking ankle dorsiflexion, when I go to end range of motion, I'll compensate by flattening out my arch. I don't want to do that, okay? If you touch the wall by flattening out that arch and toeing out, that's not a pass. That's a fail, all right? So you set yourself up about 4 to 5 inches from the wall, 5 inches for tall folks, 4 inches for short folks, and you drive your knee over your second toe and see if you can touch the knee to the wall. Now, if you can, that's a pass. If you can't, it means you're probably a little bit stiff and you're going to benefit from adding a little extra ankle mobility, right? So first, I really want to say, before we go over some ankle mobilizations for you to try, that you really can't skip this step, right? And, the story I hear all the time for folks is they come up to me and they say, my ankles are super stiff. I need to get my ankles more mobile. I've tried every single mobilization and I've never made any improvement, right? So I'm like, oh, wow, that stinks. Let's troubleshoot this a little bit. Why is this happening? And I'll ask them like, hey, did you assess your ankle range of motion, before you started doing the mobility drills? And they're like, oh, well, no, I never thought about that, and I don't think most people do think about that. It's not intuitive. But here's the thing. If someone's asking you, to lose weight, right, and you tell them, oh, you got to diet, and they go home and they do a diet and they come back 4 weeks later and they're like, hey, it didn't work, right? You would say like, well, did you weigh yourself at the start? And they may say, no, I never weighed myself. It's like, well, how do you expect to know if you got any better or worse, right? So ankle dorsiflexion is no different. You have to first assess your range of motion, and then you have to try a mobility program for at least about 4 weeks and then assess again. And then you'll actually see if you're making progress or not, right? And the thing is, if you're not making progress, you just change up the program. It's the same as someone who tries a diet that doesn't work. It's maybe not that dieting is not working for you. Maybe you need to change your diet up a little bit, right? So what are the best ankle mobility exercises for better squats and Olympic lifts? Now, I kind of apologize here because I think most folks, when they click on a video about the best exercise for ankle dorsiflexion, they're expecting all sorts of fancy stuff, right? Banded ankle dorsiflexion exercises. Maybe we're doing some PNF stretches, all sorts of fancy things. I feel very, very strongly that we should be using the evidence we have that shows, the best guidelines for mobility as opposed to shotgunning a bunch of fancy exercises to improve our patients' mobility, right? So we got to use evidence-based guidelines, and we have to develop a program with sets and reps, right? So when you go to the doctor's office and you have some sort of ailment and they give you a medication, right? They're going to say, hey, I want you to take this medication, but they're also going to give you guidelines for how often to take it, right? They're going to say, I want you to take 2 pills twice a day for 2 weeks or whatever it is, right? So when the physical therapists or coaches say, you need to get more mobile, here's 3 exercises, I want you to do them. How often do you do them? How frequently do you do them, right? Because we have some pretty clear information that if you don't do the stretches for long enough, right? Or if you don't do it frequently enough, you don't make a change. And then we go back to the whole discussion of, I tried a mobility program, it didn't work. Well, it's like, well, did you do the right exercises? A, did you do them for long enough? Did you do them with the right frequencies, durations, all that stuff? So I just think it's super important that we know about these. I've written a lot about these parameters. If you want to see some of the evidence over static stretching, I'll put a link that you can click on. All right, a little bit later. So what do I personally recommend to get people more mobile for squats and Olympic lifts? So I usually give people a combination of soft tissue work, right? So this is going to be some sort of foam rolling generally. And what's important to understand is that most of the research on foam rolling for ankle mobility is you make a short-term change, right? I'm not against short-term changes, because if you're going to do soft tissue work then squat immediately after, you're going to, get the benefits of that short-term improvement, right? And in terms of how frequently you want to be doing this to make it more of a long-term effect, there's been one study that I know of that did some sort of foam rolling for the calf for 3 weeks. They did it 3 times, or excuse me, they did it for 4 weeks, 3 times per week. And they're doing it for 60 seconds to the calf. And they did a test and retest, and they made an improvement in range of motion. So my general recommendation for foam rolling for folks that are trying to improve their ankle flexibility is to foam roll the calves 3 times per week for 60 seconds for at least 4 weeks, and then reassess, right? That being said, I also like to put static stretching, good old ankle stretches. Usually I'll use an ankle stretch against the wall, like this image on the top right here. And the research we have on static stretching is it tends to beat out other forms of stretching, right? It's actually superior to PNF stretching, ballistic stretching, dynamic stretching. There is some research to show it temporarily reduces power, and it doesn't necessarily change the physiology of the muscle. That doesn't mean it's not effective for improving range of motion. It's actually very effective for that, right? So I have my athletes do 60 seconds of static stretching of the soleus 5 times per week, and I do it for 4 weeks. Like I said previously, we have some research to show that if we don't have a high enough frequency, right? So if you just stretch 3 times a week, you might not make a change at all. We need to make sure we have enough frequency within the week. So 5 or more times per week and at least 60 seconds. And just one set, because in the same study I'm talking about, so again, I'll throw that link up there. You can click on it. If you did more than 60 seconds, it wasn't more better. You didn't gain more flexibility. So I think you're spinning your wheels if you're doing more than about 60 seconds at a time. The next piece is that you have to do it for at least 4 weeks to make a change. Going back to the example of someone who didn't make progress, if you do stretches for 2 weeks, right, and you didn't progress, then it doesn't mean that the stretching didn't work. If you talk to a lot of elite gymnasts, in order to improve their mobility, it took years and years to do that, okay? So it just takes a lot of dedication to build the mobility where you want, right? The other intervention I use a ton for ankle flexibility are going to be eccentrics. So an eccentric contraction is going to be the muscle firing while the muscle is lengthening. So think about doing a calf raise. When you get to the top of the calf raise and we're descending back to the bottom position, right? So we're getting that stretch in the bottom position of a calf raise. That's an eccentric contraction. All right. We have a lot of research on these showing that they're effective, right, for improving mobility, but also about effective as static stretching, which is wonderful, right? The other thing that's very cool about eccentrics is that we don't have to do them as frequently as static stretching in order to make, to make progress in flexibility. So the research on eccentrics in terms of the sets and reps that are most optimal for range of motion, it's all over the place, right? But suffice to say, if you're doing it for about 2 to 3 times per week, somewhere between 1 and 3 sets, somewhere between 6 and 8 repetitions, we do this for 4 weeks, we're probably going to make a change. So what's my favorite exercise from an eccentric perspective for ankle mobility? I love single-legged calf raises, where on the way up, you can use your other leg to help out, and then a very slow eccentric lower to the very bottom position of the calf raise with a stretch. Okay, so maybe that's 3 to 5 seconds on the lowering phase with a 2 to 3 second pause at the bottom, come right back up to the start position and do 6 to 8 repetitions of that. Okay, so that's it. Soft tissue work followed by static stretching, followed by eccentrics, doing that for about 4 weeks. And then you reassess your range of motion. The other thing that's probably, and I shouldn't say probably because I think it's really important, is to make sure you're utilizing this new flexibility when you're squatting in the future. All right. So my recommendation for folks after they do their mobility program is that they should probably squat afterward or Olympic lift afterward and spend some time in the very bottom position of the squat and try to actively utilize all of the range of motion you just created in the ankle. And the other thing to think about is that if you just created new range of motion in the ankle and you're loading up a heavy squat, chances are you're not going to use that new range of motion just because you are practiced in a position that doesn't have that same ankle range of motion, and you are strong in a position that doesn't utilize that new range of motion just because you've never trained that new position. So you may find you have to knock a little bit of weight off the bar, and when you go down to the squat, you have to constantly remind yourself to use that new ankle range of motion, and when you come out of the hole, not to just shoot your hips straight up and back into the same position it used to use for years and years, right? So that is it, guys. Thank you so much for your support. If you are listening to this on your podcast, please give me a positive rating and review. If you're watching this via YouTube, please give me a thumbs up. I'd love to hear your comments on this. How do you improve ankle range of motion in your athletes? Subscribe to the channel for more content, reminders about new stuff that's coming out. If you want to support me that extra little bit, head over to fitnesspainfree.com, click on programs, click on Fitness Pain Free Insiders Online Library, where you can see sample mobility programs for the squat. I can go into ankle mobility more in depth. I can go into eccentrics. I can go into flexibility training. I've got all sorts of seminars on there to improve your knowledge about mobility for the squat. That's it, guys. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you soon.